everyone, this is PK Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a full-on spoiler review for Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Now there could also be spoilers for all other movies and series within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so just beware when going into this overall video. And you can check out my non-spoiler review of the film, and I'll leave a link within the description. Now this won't be a chronological breakdown, but much more of a free-flowing discussion about the standout elements of the movie that I feel are worth discussing the most. So this is your final warning now, spoilers for Black Panther Wakanda Forever in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I want to touch on is the element that I believe everybody has to mention when referencing this film, and that is of course paying proper homage to both T'Challa the character and also Chadwick Boseman, who we all know sadly passed away from stage 4 colon cancer back in August 2020. Now we all knew there would be some passage of events acknowledging the actor's passing alongside the decision not to recast the character. Now I ultimately feel that they should have recast. I think a bit of time should have been given for them to reassess their decisions before making the ultimate choice not to recast the character. Now despite all of this, many were going into this film expecting plenty of moments to be very much emotionally impactful, but from the perspective of an individual movie, I have to say that these moments, whilst well intended, didn't quite hit the impact that I thought they would have done when going into the film. Now overall, we did have two sequences, one at the beginning and one at the end of the film. At the beginning, we had the funeral sequence of T'Challa that was seen in the trailers, and I think this was a bit rushed. Perhaps they didn't want the movies beginning to be too heavy for viewers going into it, so I do understand that they were a bit quick, but I think they should have allowed the moment to linger just a little bit longer. Now the final scenes at the movie where we see Shuri sitting on the beach, having memories of T'Challa, where they played quick clips of Chadwick from the first film in complete silence, where we see the wind blowing in the background. That impact did hit home, and it did draw a lot of emotion from the audiences within the cinema. But as I said overall in my non-spoiler review, I do think they played it just right in paying proper respect to the actor and the character, and it didn't impact the movie's standalone story. We then talk about the staging of the action sequences and the visual aesthetic of the film, which for me was an issue. And it really had to do with all of those faded, saturated contrast and colours that we've seen really recently, especially in the MCU Disney Plus shows. And there were certain times where the screen filter was just too dark and you couldn't really make out what was going on. This is especially when we see the Taliban attacking the military base, as they've used a device created by Riri Williams to detect the vibranium underwater. And sequences like this, it was just too dark and there was too much shaky cam. Again, I don't know why director Ryan Coogler decided to use this technique for these sequences, and the action itself was just too incoherent. This was the same when we saw the military attack on the Wakandian outpost for the vibranium, and I was a bit worried going into this that this style of action would happen for the entire movie, but thankfully it didn't. Some of the CGI was very weak, where we see Namor attacking the Wakandian ships, leaping and bouncing all over the buildings, and whilst it was good that they made Namor a very powerful force, I kept thinking, was he a bit OP? Did they go a bit over the top in showcasing how powerful he was? And there were also times when he just looked a bit rubbery in motion when he was leaping over all of the ships and using his spear to take them down. And I just feel at this point there should be a much more high standard in terms of the overall effects when showcasing these comic book characters. The city of Talokan itself, which we see close to around the halfway point throughout the film, just didn't look anything too spectacular. Now the comparisons of Atlantis from DC can't be helped. The fact that Namor and Aquaman are very similar in tone and aesthetic in terms of their character and their origins. But the Aquaman movie showcased Atlantis with a real visual splendour and colour. But this underwater city here, aesthetically, was just a bit grey and a bit uninspired. We then talk about some of the characters, and as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, Angela Bassett was at times completely imperious as Queen Ramonda. How this woman hasn't won an Oscar yet is beyond me, but Queen Ramonda was certainly the driving force in the early stages of the film. We had that great scene where she warns all of the other nations at the UN summit of them trying to steal vibranium, and she really brought that sense of gravitas and power to the overall film. However, I did take one issue with Ramonda, and this is where we get to the scene where she outs Okoye from the Wakandan forces, blaming her for Shuri being kidnapped by the Talibans and also taking Riri Williams. And whilst the scene was very impactful, it had me liking Ramonda a bit less, especially when we saw the earliest sequence of Okoye in one of the best fight scenes of the film, where we see her taking on 4 of the Talibans single-handedly on the bridge, and this was very visual and intense, and a great standout moment for Okoye, and she really couldn't have done anything more to try and save Shuri. I understand Ramonda recently losing T'Challa was already in some sort of emotional distress, but her rage was really misguided here, especially when she approved for Shuri to accompany Okoye to go and rescue Riri Williams. Now, I do understand that this was very much more of a stealth mission, that they didn't want to be detected by the police forces who were already looking out for the Wakandians, but she could have done a lot more to really enhance the security, especially when you consider that Shuri is the princess of Wakanda. So whilst I didn't agree with this moment, in one way it did allow Okoye to go on much more of a substantial character arc, which is very good for the character, because I believe in the earlier parts of the film they were making her very much the comic relief, and this is something I was worried about throughout the film, that she would just be relegated to just generating the humour, but luckily they managed to give her some sort of substantial impact throughout the entire film. So we then talk about Riri Williams, and as per my non-spoiler review, I'm still very mixed on the character overall. She had the typical attitude and sassiness, that all-knowing attitude that we see far too often in these movies today, and it's just not very likeable for me, and in the end the character just comes across as very arrogant. I just couldn't buy the idea that Riri at 19 years old was designing and constructing all of these top-level algorithms and devices in a space of a few months. When did she learn all of this? Who exactly taught her? I guess we'll find out in the Ironheart series, which comes out next year. And I know that Riri Williams, being technologically gifted, is part of the source material creation, but it just strained credibility for me. I just really couldn't accept that this young teenager was finding the time to design all of these projects, and that she was way more advanced in capability and knowledge than all other qualified scientists. It just never really worked for me. Now, I do understand that they want to promote her and try to draw more viewers into her story with her upcoming series, but making her also the central figure of the conflict between Wakanda and Talokan, this was just placing too much importance on the character, and it really didn't need it. And I think it's a valid question that needs to be asked. Did Riri Williams need to be in this movie? Was she necessary to this story? Would cutting her out made it a better film overall? Well, it certainly would have made it a shorter film, that's for damn sure. And whilst I did like the dynamic between Riri, Shuri and Okoye, I'm just not sure Riri Williams, apart from promoting her own series, was actually needed, and I think she was probably a bit too much involved within this overall story. We then talk about Shuri, who probably had the most emotional arc of the entire film, and they did very well to emphasise the pain and loss and anger that she suffered throughout the entire story, and they kept it consistent the entire time. I did like the scene between her and Namor in Talokan when he's showing her all of the city, and they have that great discussion when they talk about the essence of revenge and trying to burn the world down. This is something that Shuri referenced in the earlier conversation with Queen Ramonda, and at this stage you believe Shuri to be the far more wiser individual. But they did take a very interesting turn when Shuri recreates the herb that enables her to become the Black Panther, and we see her suddenly become consumed by rage and vengeance. Now, this made complete sense in terms of the story. I love the scene between her and M'Baku as he's infatuated all of the people of Wakanda, and we see them conversing together, and he looks absolutely shocked at Shuri's anger and rage. And he himself shows signs of far more wisdom when he talks about the fact that killing Namor won't really resolve the war, as his people look to him as some sort of god. He tries to explain to Shuri that if she murders Namor, it would just intensify the conflict. So in many ways, this is a shining moment for M'Baku as a character. And they did continue further with the sense of revenge. In terms of Shuri, when she sees Killmonger in the ancestral plane, now obviously this was done in the absence of Chadwick, because normally when you enter this plane and you're taken over the Black Panther mantle, you see the person that you love the most or who inspired you the most. We saw this obviously in the scenes from the first film when T'Challa saw his father, and also when Killmonger saw his father. But having Shuri meet Killmonger, who himself was driven by rage and vengeance, and keeping his personality the same, again was very consistent, and it gave again a greater sense of context as to all of the emotions that Shuri was experiencing. And seeing her turn to the darker side to an extent gave the movie a much more intensity and weight in its final third. So we then talk about Shuri assuming the mantle of Black Panther. Now, I know there's been a lot of very passionate views on this. There are some people that don't care. There are some people that are very angry, and they see it as, once again, the mantle being passed to a female character. We get all of the usual allusions to the MCU once more. Some people are very angry that she assumes the costume too easily or too cheaply. I didn't see that. I think they took enough time In building it up so we saw Shuri take on the costume, we had enough of an explanation as we see her and Riri Williams working together to design the herb that would enable her to take on the substance in order to assume the Black Panther power. And overall, I liked the design of her in the suit. It was still very sleek and modern looking like the first costume that T'Challa wore, and I also liked how they integrated the golden segments into the overall design. It just gave it a very unique and different feel. And overall, I thought it looked very good in the movement, especially in the scenes towards a climatic battle at the end and the eventual confrontation against Namor. And we'll then move on to Namor himself, and if you've watched my channel, you'll know my dislike of the direction that they took aesthetically with the character. I understand wanting to input your own mark and style on the character involved, but this was such a radical take that doesn't look like the character at all. And yes, I do think it's still important, especially when you're adapting these superhero movies, that you should try and stick as close as possible to the source material, both aesthetically and in terms of the tone of the character himself. Now, in terms of the character, Namor's motivations were very inconsistent. At first, he just wants to punish Riri Williams, as she's the scientist who designs the device that detected the vibranium sources underwater. But this really doesn't make any sense, because if you just take Riri Williams away, the government will just hire another scientist to build more devices. So again, this goes back to my other issue of trying to make Riri Williams the central figure in the overall conflict. We then see later on Namor shifting his motivations. This time he wants to take over all of the Earth's nations. But if this was his original design all along, then why has he taken so long to do this? We get that extended backstory where we learn of how exactly he got his powers. They again made reference to the fact that he is one of the first mutants that have emerged within the surface world, and this is something I don't like. We already had reference to the mutants in the Miss Marvel series, and when they keep doing this within Phase 4, it just leaves me very worried as to how exactly they're going to integrate the X-Men into the overall universe. You're just name dropping the word mutants without any context or mention of the X-Men, so I just feel, why do it? It doesn't really add anything in terms of this overall story. Now, in terms of Namor's backstory and motivation, it didn't really ring true. He wants to destroy the surface world because when he went to bury his mother on the surface, he saw people being enslaved by Spanish owners, who called him the child without no love, which also means Namor, or Namor as they're pronouncing it throughout the movie, and this was Marvel's way of trying to distinguish the character being different from the original source material. But once again, if you're going to go so radically different, why not just create a new character or call him somebody different? Now overall, this just wasn't a convincing reason for Namor to claim war on all of the surface world, and again, why would he have waited all this time? So despite the fact that I had no issues with the actor's performance, the overall motivations just weren't very solid. Now, I did really like the musical soundtrack and score that played right throughout this film. The overall composer was by Ludwig Göransson, who has composed a lot of high-profile movies later. He also provided the score, I believe, also for both The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett series. Now, we did get a lot of those war chant noises that played every time that the Taliban showed up. We heard this in certain sequences when they were using sonic devices to manipulate the soldiers and making them jump off the military bases. We saw this again during the great battle against Wakandians. And I also liked the music that played when Namor was showing Shuri during the city of Talokan, where she's exploring all of the different sites. I just really liked all of the tones and synthesized beats that we were showing throughout here. It just lent the sequence and the scene a certain weight to it. So if anybody can tell me the title track of this particular sequence, I will appreciate it a lot. But without question, the soundtrack was definitely one of the high parts of the overall movie. We then go on to the final climatic battle, where we see that Shuri and the other Wakandians have planned to draw out Namor into the surface when they discover that he very much relies on breathing both the water and the oxygen together. And in terms of these movies now, the spectacle is very typical, where we once again cross-cut against multiple battles and fights happening at once. This is of course where we see the armies of both Wakanda and Talokan battling it out. We then cross-cut this with scenes of Riri Williams in the Iron Man armor, power suit, and she's flying in the air, taking out all of the ships. I felt this was kind of distracting away from the main battles that were far more important, and this is again them wanting to showcase how integral and important Riri Williams is to the overall battle. Now, to be fair, the action here was staged far more better than what I mentioned in the earlier parts of the films, but at the same time, the action got a bit frenetic and chaotic as we kept cutting across different battles. And I just think this took away from the final fight between Shuri and Namor, which did have some intense moments where we see Shuri being stabbed by Namor's spear, and then Shuri causes the ship to explode. This is when they're fighting in the desert, when she's managed to lure him away from the water. She gives the Wakanda Forever pose as she causes the ship to explode, burning and scarring Namor's back. And this was quite violent for a Marvel movie. I am surprised that they were able to add this level of intensity to the battle, but again, this would have had far more weight if we had just isolated this battle completely. But I did like the final part of this fight when Shuri has Namor defeated because he suffocates from the lack of water, and as she holds him at spear point, we get a playback of the movie's events in reverse order. So throughout all of the several losses and battles and fights, and we see this playing out as we see the expression on Shuri's face, and this is her coming to the realization that it's not all about war and killing, it's all about preserving your people. And this is something that is played all the way throughout the film, not only in terms of Shuri but also in terms of Namor as well. And this is what causes him to ultimately make the decision to yield, as Shuri offers to work together alongside the Talakans and protect them alongside Wakanda. So whilst this was very well intended, and some may say it's again a very novel approach as to normally having the good guys just beat the evil bad guys, I do feel to an extent it just wrapped up things a little too nicely, a little too neatly, when we see Shuri standing alongside Namor and just bringing the overall conflict to an end. This goes back to my original issue, how we're seeing far too often now in these Marvel movies the villain not really being the villain, they're just making him too sympathetic, too empathetic, and it just takes away some of the intensity in the overall battle. How can we fully invest in the conflict if we think at the end of the story everybody's going to make up friends and hold hands together in perfect harmony? And then the movie ended, as I mentioned at the start of the film, where we see Shuri reflecting on her memories of T'Challa in a very well emotional moment. And then we move on to the end credit scene, where we see Nakia introducing her son to Shuri sitting on the beach, and then we get the revelation that it is indeed T'Challa's son, and that T'Challa was aware of his illness, but he told Okoye and her son to stay away as he didn't want them to be impacted by his overall death. Now, I wasn't completely sure of this, or indeed the fact that T'Challa would hide away his son from the events. I think overall this wasn't the best way of Marvel to handle this. They clearly wanted there to be some sort of passing of the baton, of the legacy of Chadwick and indeed T'Challa. But for me personally, this just reinforced the fact that they should have recast the character. What's the point in killing off the character if you're then saying that there is a future son who later on down the line will become the Black Panther in the future? Now, on the one hand, it did provide a very optimistic and hopeful beat for the future of the universe, as we will eventually see this young kid grow up and take over the Black Panther mantle. And maybe this will be Marvel planning for the future ahead as we go into phases 6 and 7 and the eventual multiverse saga and Avengers Secret Wars crossover, which will no doubt shake up the status quo of the MCU and take it forward in a different direction, of which I am of no doubt. So there's my overall thoughts and feelings and spoiler review of Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Which of the moments were you feeling were the most standout throughout the entire film? Let me know in the comments and we can have further discussion. Do you think overall this was amongst the best or the worst of the Marvel's Phase 4? Also let me know. I will eventually provide a video where I summarise the Phase 4 in its entirety, now that we have confirmed that Black Panther Wakanda Forever is the final movie within this Phase 4, and really just go over what went well and what didn't go as well within the Phase 4, and how Marvel can make improvements going forward for Phases 5, 6 and 7. So look out for that video shortly within the channel, and if you have any other further suggestions in terms of content, whether it's movies, televisions or any other topics or issues within the entertainment industry that you'd like to see me cover, then please also let me know within the comments, and I will see about providing that commentary for you in the future on this channel. Please also hit like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.